The emergency room at San Diego General Hospital buzzed with controlled chaos on that humid Tuesday evening. The familiar sounds of beeping monitors, hurried footsteps, and urgent conversations filled the air as medical professionals moved through their routines with practiced precision. Among them, Navy SEAL medic Jake Morrison stood out not just for his imposing 6'2" frame, but for the calm confidence that radiated from him as he worked. Jake had transitioned from active combat duty to civilian emergency medicine just 8 months earlier, carrying with him the advanced trauma skills learned on battlefields across 3 continents. His colleagues respected his ability to remain steady under pressure, a trait that had saved countless lives during his 12 years of service. Tonight felt like any other night until the ambulance bay doors burst open with an urgency that made everyone pause. Female, mid-20s motorcycle accident on Highway 163, the paramedic called out as they wheeled in the stretcher. Unconscious at scene, possible head trauma, multiple lacerations, and what appears to be a compound fracture of the left tibia. Jake immediately stepped forward, his trained eyes assessing the patient as they moved her into Trauma Bay 3. The woman appeared young, perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair matted with blood and dirt. Her leather jacket had been cut away by the paramedics, revealing a white tank top beneath that was torn and stained. Despite the obvious trauma, there was something about her face that struck Jake as familiar, though he couldn't place where he might have seen her before. "What's her name?" Jake asked as he began his initial examination, checking her pupils for signs of brain injury. "No identification found at the scene," the paramedic replied. "Bike was registered to a Sarah Chun, but we can't confirm if that's her." Good Samaritan called it in after seeing her go down near the Balboa Park exit. As Jake worked methodically through his assessment, checking vital signs, and looking for additional injuries, he noticed something that made him pause. Along the woman's right forearm, partially hidden by dried blood, were what appeared to be old scars. Not the random marks of childhood accidents, but deliberate, precise lines that spoke of a different kind of trauma entirely. His breath caught slightly as recognition began to dawn. These weren't just any scars. They were the kind he'd seen before on soldiers who had endured interrogation, on operatives who had survived capture. The spacing, the depth, the way they ran parallel to major blood vessels while carefully avoiding them. This was the work of someone who understood human anatomy and psychological warfare. Jake's hands moved with increased care as he continued his examination, his mind racing with possibilities he didn't want to acknowledge. When he reached her left shoulder blade to check for additional trauma, he found what confirmed his growing suspicions. There, partially obscured by road rash from the accident, was a small tattoo that made his blood run cold. It was a simple design, a black dagger surrounded by wings, no bigger than a quarter. To most people, it would look like nothing more than decorative body art. But Jake knew better. He had seen that exact symbol before in classified briefings and on the arms of the most elite female operatives in the military. It was the unofficial mark of the Shadow Angels, an all-female special operations unit that officially didn't exist. The Shadow Angels were ghosts in the military system, women recruited from various special forces units who specialized in deep cover operations in hostile territories where male operatives couldn't blend in. They were trained in advanced combat techniques, resistance to interrogation, and psychological warfare. Most importantly, they were trained to disappear completely when their missions ended, to reintegrate into civilian life as if their service had never happened. Jake's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as he processed this revelation. He had heard whispers about the Shadow Angels during his time in special operations, stories that were quickly dismissed or redirected whenever they came up in conversation. The few details that had filtered through spoke of women who had endured unimaginable hardships in service to their country, only to return home to silence and anonymity. "Dr. Morrison, are you all right?" The voice of Nurse Patricia Williams broke through his thoughts. Patricia had worked in the ER for 15 years and had developed an uncanny ability to read the stress levels of the medical staff. "Yes, I'm fine," Jake replied, though his voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before. "Let's get her to radiology for a full workup. I want CT scans of her head, chest, and abdomen, and x-rays of that leg fracture." As the trauma team prepared to move the patient, Jake found himself studying her face more intently. Even unconscious and injured, there was a hardness to her features that spoke of experiences beyond her years. The muscle definition in her arms and shoulders was unmistakable. This was someone who had maintained peak physical condition, someone whose body had been honed into a weapon. The radiology results came back faster than usual, perhaps influenced by Jake's obvious concern for this particular patient. The good news was that her head injury appeared to be a moderate concussion with no signs of brain bleeding. Her chest x-ray was clear, and while the leg fracture was serious, it was clean and would heal well with proper surgical intervention. Jake stood in the hallway outside her room, holding the tablet with her scan results, trying to make sense of what he had discovered. The logical part of his mind told him to treat her like any other patient, to focus on her immediate medical needs, and leave the questions about her past for later. But the soldier in him, the part that had been trained to recognize threats and opportunities, knew that this woman represented something significant. As he re-entered the trauma bay, Jake noticed that the patient was beginning to show signs of consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered, and her breathing pattern had changed from the deep, regular rhythm of unconsciousness to something more erratic. He moved closer to her bedside, prepared for the moment when she would fully awaken. When her eyes finally opened, Jake was struck by their intensity. They were deep brown, almost black, and even in her injured state, they moved with the quick, assessing gaze of someone trained to evaluate threats and exits. For just a moment, their eyes met, and Jake saw something flicker across her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe just the confusion common in head trauma patients. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. There was no panic in her tone, no fear, just the calm inquiry of someone gathering information. "You're in San Diego General Hospital," Jake replied gently. "You were in a motorcycle accident. I am Dr. Morrison. Can you tell me your name?" She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes continuing to scan the room with methodical precision. Jake could almost see her taking inventory, the number of people present, the locations of exits, the potential weapons within reach. It was the behavior of someone whose survival had once depended on such assessments. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah Chun." Jake nodded, though something in her delivery made him wonder if that was really her name or simply the identity she had chosen to use. "Sarah, you've suffered a concussion and a broken leg. We're going to take good care of you, but I need to ask you some questions about your medical history." As Jake began the standard medical interview, he found himself listening not just to her answers, but to the way she delivered them. Her responses were precise and economical, offering exactly the information requested and nothing more. When he asked about allergies, previous surgeries, or current medications, she answered with the efficiency of someone accustomed to debriefings. It was when he reached the section about scars and previous injuries that things became complicated. Jake hesitated, knowing that asking directly about the marks on her arm would likely shut down any chance of honest communication. Instead, he approached the subject indirectly. "I noticed some scarring on your right arm," he said carefully. "Can you tell me how those happened? It's important for us to know in case there are any underlying nerve or circulation issues." Sarah's expression didn't change, but Jake caught the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested he had hit a sensitive area. "Accident when I was younger," she said simply. "Nothing that affects my current health." The answer was too smooth, too practiced. Jake recognized the tone of someone who had rehearsed a cover story until it became second nature. He made a note in her chart and continued with the examination, but his mind was already working through the implications of what he had discovered. As the evening progressed and Sarah was moved to a regular room for observation, Jake found himself making excuses to check on her more frequently than medically necessary. Each time, he noticed new details that reinforced his growing certainty about her background. The way she positioned herself in the hospital bed to maintain a clear view of both the door and window. The fact that she ate her hospital meal with her left hand while keeping her right hand free. The manner in which her eyes tracked the movement of every person who entered her room. It was nearly midnight when Jake finally allowed himself to confront what he had been avoiding all evening. This woman, this Sarah Chun, was almost certainly a former member of one of the military's most classified units. She had endured training that would break most people, survived missions that officially never happened, and returned to civilian life carrying secrets that could never be shared. The weight of this knowledge settled heavily on Jake's shoulders as he sat in the break room, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. He understood the bonds that connected people who had served in special operations, the unspoken recognition that passed between those who had seen the darkest corners of human conflict. But this was different. This was a reminder that even among the elite warriors he had served alongside, there were those whose sacrifices were so complete that they couldn't even be acknowledged. Jake thought about his own transition to civilian life, the challenges of finding purpose and meaning outside the structured world of military service. He had been fortunate to find work that utilized his skills and provided a sense of contribution to society. But what did someone like Sarah do when their very existence had been classified? How did a ghost find her place in a world that pretended she had never been a soldier at all? The next morning brought a new shift of nurses and doctors, but Jake made sure to remain involved in Sarah's care. When orthopedic surgeon Dr. Elena Rodriguez explained the procedure needed to repair her leg fracture, Jake stood quietly in the corner, ostensibly there for continuity of care, but really watching Sarah's reactions. Dr. Rodriguez was thorough and professional, explaining the surgery in detail and answering Sarah's questions with patience. But Jake noticed that Sarah's questions focused heavily on recovery time, physical limitations, and when she would be able to resume normal activities. They were the questions of someone whose physical capabilities were central to their sense of identity and security. The surgery itself is straightforward, Dr. Rodriguez explained. We'll insert a titanium rod to stabilize the fracture, and with proper physical therapy, you should have full function restored within 6 months. However, given the severity of the break and the trauma to surrounding tissue, I'd recommend avoiding any high-impact activities for at least a year. Sarah nodded, but Jake could see the tension in her jaw. A year of limited physical activity would be agony for someone accustomed to maintaining peak conditioning. It was another reminder of the unique challenges faced by former special operations personnel in adapting to civilian life and civilian expectations of what constituted reasonable limitations. As the day progressed, Jake found himself thinking not just about Sarah's medical needs, but about what would happen to her after discharge. The administrative records showed no emergency contacts, no family members to notify. Her address was listed as a small apartment complex in a transitional neighborhood, the kind of place where people went when they needed to disappear or start over. It was during his afternoon rounds that Jake made a decision that would change both their lives. Instead of simply treating Sarah as another patient and moving on, he chose to take a risk. As he entered her room for what would normally be a routine check, he closed the door behind him and pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I think we need to talk." She looked at him with those penetrating dark eyes, and Jake could see her defenses rising like walls. "About what, Dr. Morrison?" Jake took a breath, knowing that what he was about to say would either create a connection or destroy any trust between them. "About the fact that we both know you weren't just some civilian who happened to get hurt in a motorcycle accident." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's expression remained neutral, but Jake could see the calculations running behind her eyes. She was weighing options, considering responses, evaluating threats. It was the look of someone who had been trained to reveal nothing while gathering everything. Finally, she spoke, her voice carefully modulated. "I don't know what you're talking about, Dr. Morrison. I'm just a woman who crashed her bike." But even as she delivered the denial, Jake could see something else in her expression. Relief, perhaps, that someone had finally seen her for who she really was. Or maybe fear that her carefully constructed civilian identity was beginning to crumble. Jake leaned forward slightly, his voice remaining gentle but carrying the weight of shared experience. I served with SEAL Team 6 for 12 years. I know what training looks like, what scars from interrogation resistance look like, and I know what it means when someone carries themselves like they're always ready for a fight they hope never comes. Sarah was completely still now, her breathing controlled but shallow. Jake could see her processing his words, trying to determine if this was a threat or an opportunity. The moments stretched between them, heavy with unspoken understanding and the weight of secrets that had never been shared. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Even if what you're suggesting were true, Dr. Morrison, it wouldn't change anything. Some stories don't get told. Some service doesn't get recognized. That's just how it is. Jake felt his heart break a little at the resigned sadness in her voice. Here was a woman who had given everything for her country, who had endured unimaginable hardships in service to something larger than herself, and she had been forced to carry that burden in complete silence. No parades, no medals, no acknowledgement of her sacrifice. Maybe, Jake said softly, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it alone. The words hung in the air between them, an offering of understanding and solidarity that Sarah had probably never expected to receive. For the first time since she had been brought into the emergency room, Jake saw her carefully maintained composure begin to crack. It was just a slight trembling in her lower lip, a brightness in her eyes that suggested tears she wouldn't allow herself to shed. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why does it matter to you?" Jake considered his answer carefully. "Because I know what it's like to come home from something that officially never happened. I know what it feels like to have experiences that you can't share with anyone who hasn't been there. And I know what it's like to wonder if anyone would understand, even if you could tell them." Sarah looked away for a moment, staring out the window at the San Diego skyline. When she turned back to Jake, something fundamental had shifted in her expression. The walls were still there, but they had developed cracks that allowed him to glimpse the person underneath. "My name isn't really Sarah Chun," she said quietly, "but I can't tell you what it really is." Jake nodded. "I understand. I was hurt before. Badly. In ways that have nothing to do with this motorcycle accident. I know, and I don't know how to be a normal person. I don't know how to have a regular job or regular relationships or regular problems." The honesty in her voice was raw and painful. Jake realized that this might be the first time she had ever spoken these truths aloud. The first time she had acknowledged to another person the depth of her struggle to find her place in civilian life. "That's okay," Jake said. "Normal is overrated anyway." Despite everything, Sarah almost smiled at that. It was just a slight upturn at the corner of her mouth, but it was the first genuine expression Jake had seen from her. In that moment, he realized that beneath the careful control and practiced attachment was a woman who was profoundly lonely, who had been carrying the weight of her secrets and her service with no one to share the burden. As visiting hours ended and the hospital settled into the quieter rhythm of evening, Jake found himself making another decision that went against his usual professional boundaries. Instead of leaving Sarah to face the long night alone with her thoughts and memories, he pulled some strings with the nursing staff and arranged to stay late, ostensibly to monitor her post-concussion symptoms. They didn't talk much during those quiet hours. Sometimes Jake would check her neurological responses or adjust her pain medication. Sometimes they would sit in comfortable silence, two veterans who understood that some experiences couldn't be captured in words. But mostly, Jake's presence served as a reminder that Sarah wasn't as alone as she had believed. It was near dawn when Sarah finally spoke again, her voice thoughtful and distant. "I used to think that the hardest part was over there in the field. The missions, the capture, the interrogation. But it turns out the hardest part is coming home and pretending none of it ever happened." Jake understood exactly what she meant. He had been fortunate to serve in a capacity that, while classified, was at least acknowledged. His sacrifice was recognized, his service honored. But Sarah and others like her had been erased from history, their contributions deemed too sensitive even for the highest security clearances. "You don't have to pretend with me," Jake said simply. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the hospital window, both Sarah and Jake knew that something significant had shifted between them. They were no longer just doctor and patient, but two people who had found an unexpected understanding in the midst of carefully guarded solitude. The road ahead would be complicated and uncertain, but for the first time in years, neither of them would have to walk it entirely alone. The surgery to repair Sarah's leg fracture went smoothly, but Jake found himself more nervous than he had been during his most challenging battlefield medical procedures. He watched from the observation gallery as Dr. Rodriguez expertly inserted the titanium rod, his hands clenched unconsciously as he observed the careful work being done on someone who had become more than just a patient to him. When Sarah emerged from anesthesia, Jake was the first face she saw. Despite the grogginess that typically followed major surgery, her eyes immediately focused with the sharp awareness that had become familiar to him. Even in her vulnerable state, she was scanning, assessing, maintaining the vigilance that had kept her alive in situations most people couldn't imagine. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice thick from the breathing tube, but steady with determination. "Perfectly," Jake assured her. Dr. Rodriguez said the placement couldn't have been better. "You're going to make a full recovery." Sarah nodded, but Jake could see the shadow of doubt that crossed her face. Recovery meant different things to different people, and he suspected that Sarah's definition of full recovery involved capabilities that most civilians never needed to consider. The ability to run for miles without stopping, to climb walls, to fight if necessary. These were the standards by which she would measure her healing. Over the next few days, as Sarah progressed through the initial stages of recovery, Jake found himself drawn into conversations that went far beyond medical care. It started with simple questions about his own military service, casual inquiries that seemed innocent but revealed a deeper need to establish trust and common ground. 12 years with the SEALs, Sarah said during one of their evening conversations. "That's a significant commitment. What made you choose emergency medicine afterward?" Jake had been asked this question many times by colleagues and friends, and he usually gave the standard answer about wanting to continue serving and using his trauma skills in civilian life. But with Sarah, he found himself being more honest than usual. "I needed something that felt real," he said. "In special ops, everything was classified, compartmentalized. You'd complete a mission, save lives, make a difference, and then you could never talk about it. Here, when I save someone, their family thanks me. The community sees the result. It's immediate and visible and real in a way that my military service never could be." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Jake could see her processing not just his words, but the implications for her own situation. Unlike him, she couldn't even acknowledge that her service had existed. There were no skills she could openly transfer, no story she could share, no framework for explaining the gap in her employment history that special operations had created. "What did you do before?" Jake asked gently. "What's your cover story?" The question made Sarah smile ruefully. College graduate who spent a few years traveling abroad before settling down. Freelance graphic design work to explain the irregular income and flexible schedule. It's boring enough that most people don't ask follow-up questions. Jake marveled at the elaborate fiction required to maintain even basic social interactions. Every conversation Sarah had with potential employers, friends, or romantic interests was built on a foundation of necessary deception. The isolation that such a life required was staggering. "That must be exhausting," he observed. "You have no idea," Sarah replied. "Sometimes I forget which version of myself I'm supposed to be. I'll catch myself about to mention something that Sarah Chun could never have experienced, and I have to course correct mid-sentence. It's like being an actor who never gets to leave the stage." As the days passed and Sarah's physical therapy began, Jake had opportunities to observe her in different contexts. Even confined to a hospital bed with a significant leg injury, she maintained a level of physical fitness that impressed the nursing staff. Her upper body strength was remarkable, allowing her to move and position herself with an ease that most patients couldn't manage. But it was during her first physical therapy session that Jake truly understood the depth of Sarah's conditioning and determination. Physical therapist Mark Rodriguez, Dr. Rodriguez's younger brother, had developed a reputation for pushing patients to achieve results that other therapists thought impossible. Sarah, however, pushed back. "I need to know exactly what my limitations are," she told Mark during their initial consultation. "Not general guidelines or typical recovery timelines. I need to know precisely what I can and cannot do at each stage of healing." Mark, accustomed to patients who wanted reassurance and gradual progress, seemed taken aback by Sarah's intensity. "Well, typically we start with basic range of motion exercises and slowly build up strength over several months." "That's not what I asked," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to precise communications in high-stakes situations. "I need specific benchmarks. At what point can I support my full body weight? When can I run? How much impact can the hardware tolerate?" Jake watched this interaction from the doorway, recognizing the fundamental disconnect between civilian healthcare expectations and the mindset of someone whose physical capabilities have been central to their survival. For Sarah, these weren't abstract questions about eventual fitness goals. They were critical intelligence about her operational readiness. After the session, Jake approached Mark privately to help bridge this communication gap. "Sarah has a background in competitive athletics," he explained, using a cover story that would make her questions seem reasonable without raising security concerns. "She's accustomed to very specific training protocols and performance metrics." Mark nodded, seemingly relieved to have a framework for understanding his challenging new patient. "That makes sense. I've worked with Olympic athletes before, and they do tend to approach recovery differently. I'll make sure to give her the detailed information she's looking for." That evening, Jake found Sarah staring out her hospital window at the lights of the city below. Her expression was distant, and he could sense the restlessness that came from being confined and inactive. For someone whose life had been built around mission readiness and physical capability, the enforced rest of recovery was its own form of torture. "Penny for your thoughts," Jake said as he settled into the chair beside her bed. Sarah turned to him with a sad smile. "I was just thinking about how different this is from other times I've been injured." "Other times?" Sarah hesitated, then seemed to make a decision about how much she was willing to share. "Field injuries were different. You pushed through them, did what needed to be done, worried about proper healing later. There was always a mission to complete, objectives that mattered more than personal comfort or long-term physical consequences." Jake understood the mindset she was describing. In combat situations, adrenaline and necessity could override pain and injury in remarkable ways. But he also knew the long-term costs of such an approach, the way accumulated damage and ignored injuries could compound over years of service. "Were you hurt badly?" "Before, I mean." Sarah's expression darkened, and Jake immediately regretted the question. He was about to apologize for overstepping when she began to speak, her voice quiet and controlled. "There was a mission that went wrong. Deep cover in a hostile region, gathering intelligence on weapons trafficking. My extraction was compromised, and I spent 6 weeks in captivity before a rescue operation could be mounted." The clinical way she delivered this information didn't diminish its impact. Jake had heard similar stories from other special operations veterans, but knowing that Sarah had endured such an experience alone, without the support and recognition available to other captured service members, made it infinitely worse. "The scars on your arm," he said gently. "Among other things, yes." Sarah's voice remained steady, but Jake could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the bed sheets slightly tighter. They were very good at what they did. Professional. They understood exactly how much damage they could inflict without causing permanent injury that would compromise my intelligence value. Jake felt a cold fury building in his chest. He had seen the aftermath of torture before, had treated soldiers who had endured unimaginable suffering in enemy hands. But There was something particularly enraging about the idea that Sarah had gone through such an ordeal only to return home to silence and anonymity. Did they ever catch the people responsible? Sarah's smile was bitter. Officially, nothing ever happened to catch them for. The mission never existed, the capture never occurred, the rescue never took place. As far as any government record is concerned, I spent those 6 weeks on vacation in a non-extradition country. The casual way she delivered this information, as if the complete erasure of her suffering was simply an accepted part of the job, broke something in Jake's heart. He had never fully appreciated how fortunate he had been to serve in a capacity that, while sometimes classified, was at least acknowledged. His sacrifices, his injuries, his service, all of it was part of his official record, recognized and honored even if the details couldn't always be shared. How do you live with that? He asked. How do you carry something like that with no recognition, no support, no validation that it even happened? Sarah was quiet for a long time, her gaze returning to the window and the city lights beyond. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that spoke of years of philosophical struggle with exactly these questions. You learn to compartmentalize. You create separate spaces in your mind for the person you were during the mission and the person you need to be now. You tell yourself that the recognition doesn't matter, that you did what needed to be done regardless of whether anyone knows about it. But Jake sensed there was more. But sometimes in the middle of the night, when you can't sleep because you're still listening for footsteps in the hallway, you wonder if it was worth it. You wonder if the missions you completed actually made a difference, or if they were just exercises in political theater that happened to require real blood and real sacrifice. The honesty in her voice was devastating. Jake realized that Sarah wasn't just dealing with the physical trauma of her past injuries, but with an existential crisis about the meaning and value of her entire military career. Without the framework of recognition and honor that supported other veterans, she was left to find her own reasons for the sacrifices she had made. For what it's worth, Jake said carefully, I believe it mattered. I've seen enough classified briefings to know that intelligence gathering in hostile regions has prevented attacks, saved lives, protected national security. Even if you can't see the direct results, even if you can't be acknowledged for it, the work you did had value. Sarah looked at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with skepticism. Maybe, but it's hard to feel that value when you're sitting alone in a studio apartment, struggling to maintain relationships with people who can never know who you really are or what you've experienced. This brought up another aspect of Sarah's situation that Jake hadn't fully considered. The isolation extended beyond just professional recognition to personal relationships. How did someone form meaningful connections when such a large part of their identity and experience had to remain hidden? Have you tried dating? Jake asked, then immediately felt foolish for the casual way he had posed such a loaded question. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Oh yes, that's always fun. Tell me about yourself, Sarah. Well, I enjoy long walks on the beach, quiet dinners, and advanced interrogation resistance techniques that I learned during classified missions that officially never happened. Jake could see how the secrecy requirements would make normal relationship development nearly impossible. Trust, openness, and shared experiences were the building blocks of healthy relationships. But Sarah was prohibited from offering any of those things authentically. There was someone once, Sarah continued, her voice becoming softer. Another operator, someone who understood the life. But relationships within the program were discouraged, and when our mission started taking us to different theaters, the distance became impossible to maintain. Jake heard the regret in her voice and realized that Sarah's isolation extended even to romantic relationships with people who might have understood her situation. The demands of her service had made it impossible to maintain connections, even with those few individuals who could have offered real understanding and support. Do you ever hear from him? Sarah corrected gently. And no, I volunteer at an animal shelter. Dogs don't ask questions about your past, and they don't care about inconsistencies in your cover story. Plus, the physical demands of handling large animals helped keep me in shape. It was a practical solution that spoke to Sarah's need for both physical activity and emotional connection while minimizing the social complications that came with human relationships. Jake could imagine her finding solace in the straightforward needs of animals, the simple exchange of care and affection without complex social expectations. That sounds peaceful. It is mostly, though I did have to explain to the shelter director why I was so insistent on checking all the locks and exits during my first week. Told her I had anxiety issues from home invasion that never happened. The casual way Sarah mentioned this fabrication highlighted the constant mental effort required to maintain her civilian identity. Every interaction, every question, every moment of casual conversation required careful consideration and often outright deception. As visiting hours came to an end, Jake realized that something significant had shifted in his understanding of Sarah's situation. What had started as professional concern for a patient had evolved into something more personal, a recognition of the unique challenges she faced and a desire to offer support that went beyond medical care. "Sarah," he said as he prepared to leave, "I want you to know that you don't have to handle all of this alone. I know I can't fully understand what you've been through, but I'd like to try to help however I can." Sarah looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been hope. "Why would you do that? You barely know me." Jay considered his answer carefully. "Because I think everyone deserves to have someone in their corner, someone who sees them for who they really are. And because I have the feeling that you haven't had that in a very long time." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotion. Finally, Sarah nodded, her voice thick when she spoke. "I'd like that. More than you know." As Jake left the hospital that night, he found himself thinking not just about Sarah's medical recovery, but about what it would mean to truly help someone rebuild their life from such complete isolation. He was stepping into territory far beyond his medical expertise, offering a kind of support that had no protocols or established procedures. But he was also beginning to realize that Sarah represented something he hadn't fully understood about his own transition to civilian life. His service had been acknowledged, his skills had been transferable, his identity had remained intact. Meeting someone whose sacrifice had been so complete, so erased from official recognition, gave him a new perspective on the various ways that military service could impact a person's life. The next morning brought new challenges as Sarah began the process of planning for her discharge from the hospital. The practical questions of where she would go and how she would manage her recovery highlighted the broader issues of support and community that they had discussed the night before. "I'll need to arrange for outpatient physical therapy," Sarah said as she reviewed the discharge planning materials, "and modify my apartment for wheelchair accessibility until I'm cleared for full weight bearing." Jake listened to her matter-of-fact planning and realized that she was approaching her recovery the same way she had probably approached mission planning, methodically, independently, without assumption of external support. It was efficient and practical, but it was also profoundly lonely. "Do you have help with the apartment modifications?" he asked. Sarah shook her head. "I'll figure it out. I always do." Those 4 words, "I always do," seemed to capture everything about Sarah's approach to life since leaving the military. Self-reliant to the point of isolation, capable but utterly alone, solving every problem through individual effort because she had learned not to expect help from anyone. "What if you didn't have to figure it out alone this time?" Jake asked carefully. Sarah looked at him with surprise and suspicion. "What do you mean?" Jake took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to propose would change their relationship in ways he couldn't fully predict. "I mean, what if you had someone willing to help with the practical stuff? Someone who could assist with the apartment modifications, drive you to physical therapy appointments, be there for the difficult parts of recovery?" The silence stretched between them as Sarah processed this offer. Jake could see her running through calculations, weighing risks and benefits, try to determine if accepting help was worth the vulnerability it would require. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you want to get involved in something this complicated?" It was a fair question, and Jake realized he didn't have a simple answer. His initial attraction to Sarah had been based on professional respect and shared military experience. But as he had learned more about her situation, that respect had evolved into something deeper, a recognition of strength and resilience that had been tested in ways most people couldn't imagine. "Because I think you've been carrying this burden alone for too long," he said honestly. "And because I believe that everyone deserves a chance to heal, not just physically, but emotionally. You've given so much to protect others. Maybe it's time someone protected you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears that she quickly blinked away, but not before Jake saw the impact his words had on her. For someone who had spent years believing that her sacrifices were invisible and her struggles were hers alone to bear, the offer of genuine support was overwhelming. "I don't know how to accept help," she admitted quietly. "I don't know how to trust that someone won't use my vulnerabilities against me. It's not in my training." Jake understood the paradox she was describing. Her survival had depended on self-reliance and suspicion, but healing would require exactly the opposite: trust, vulnerability, and dependence on others. Learning to accept help would be as challenging as any physical therapy she would undergo. "We'll figure out together," Jake said simply. "No expectations, no obligations. Just two people who understand something about service and sacrifice, helping each other navigate whatever comes next." As Sarah considered his offer, Jake realized that he was proposing something that went far beyond friendship or professional collegiality. He was offering to become part of Sarah's support system, to share in the burden of her hidden identity and complicated past. It was a commitment that would require patience, understanding, and a willingness to accept that some questions might never have answers. But looking at Sarah, seeing the intelligence in her eyes, the strength in her bearing despite her injuries, the way she had maintained her humanity despite experiences that might have broken other people, Jake knew that this was exactly the kind of person worth making such a commitment to. "Okay," Sarah said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's try." The first week after Sarah's discharge from the hospital proved to be more challenging than either she or Jake had anticipated. Her apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit in a nondescript complex near the coast, had been chosen for its strategic advantages rather than comfort or accessibility. Multiple exits, clear sight lines, and neighbors who minded their own business made it ideal for someone maintaining a low profile, but terrible for someone recovering from major leg surgery. Jake arrived on a Saturday morning to find Sarah attempting to navigate her apartment on crutches while carrying a cup of coffee, her jaw set in stubborn determination despite the obvious difficulty of the task. The sight of her struggling with something as simple as making breakfast while maintaining her independence struck him as both admirable and heartbreaking. "You know, there's no shame in asking for help with the basics," Jake said as he steadied her elbow, helping her reach the couch safely. Sarah's expression was a mix of frustration and embarrassment. "I've been taking care of myself for years. I shouldn't need assistance to make coffee in my own home." Jake recognized the sentiment behind her words. For someone whose survival had depended on complete self-sufficiency, accepting help with basic tasks felt like a fundamental failure. But he also understood that recovery required a different kind of strength, the courage to be vulnerable and dependent on others. "Independence isn't about never needing help," he observed. "It's about knowing when to accept assistance so you can focus your energy on the things that matter most." Over the following days, Jake found himself becoming more deeply involved in Sarah's daily routine than either of them had expected. What had started as occasional check-ins evolved into regular visits, then into an informal schedule where Jake would stop by before and after his hospital shifts to ensure Sarah had everything she needed. The apartment modifications they implemented together revealed the extent of Sarah's tactical thinking. She had already identified the best defensive positions, mapped out escape routes, and positioned furniture to provide both cover and clear sight lines to all entrances. Jake helped her rearrange things to accommodate her temporary mobility limitations while maintaining the security features that gave her peace of mind. "You've really thought through every angle here," Jake commented as they moved her bed to provide a better view of both the front door and the fire escape. Sarah paused in their work, seeming to consider how much to explain. When you've been held captive, you spend a lot of time thinking about environmental factors that most people never consider. How quickly you can exit a room, whether furniture can provide cover, what objects could be used as weapons if necessary. It becomes automatic after a while. Jake was struck by the casual way she mentioned these considerations, as if hypervigilance and tactical assessment of living spaces were normal aspects of home decorating. He was beginning to understand that Sarah's reintegration into civilian life involved much more than career changes and identity management. It required constant mental effort to suppress instincts and behaviors that had kept her alive, but were inappropriate for peaceful environments. The physical therapy appointments provided another window into Sarah's unique challenges. Jake accompanied her to the sessions when his schedule allowed, ostensibly for transportation assistance, but really because he was fascinated by her approach to rehabilitation. Where most patients focused on returning to normal daily activities, Sarah was clearly working toward capabilities that went far beyond civilian requirements. "I need to be able to climb a rope," Sarah told Mark Rodriguez during one session. "Hand over hand, supporting full body weight, at least 20 feet. Mark looked confused. "That's pretty advanced functionality. Are you planning to take up rock climbing as a hobby?" Jake intervened before Sarah had to fabricate another cover story. Sarah's interested in obstacle course racing once she's fully recovered. Those competitions can have some pretty demanding requirements. It was becoming a familiar pattern, Jake serving as a translator between Sarah's actual needs and the explanations that would make sense to civilians. He found himself developing an arsenal of plausible cover stories that would account for her unusual questions and requirements without raising security concerns. But it was during the quieter moments, the evenings when they would sit together in her apartment sharing takeout and conversation, that Jake began to understand the deeper challenges Sarah faced. The physical recovery was straightforward compared to the psychological work of rebuilding her sense of identity and purpose. "I keep waiting for someone to give me my next assignment," Sarah admitted one evening as they watched the sunset from her living room window. "For 6 years, my life was structured around missions and objectives. Someone else decided where I would go, what I would do, how long I would stay. Now I'm supposed to create my own structure, my own purpose, and I have no idea how to do that." Jake understood the sentiment. Many veterans struggled with the transition from military structure to civilian flexibility, but Sarah's situation was more complex. She couldn't even use her military experience as a reference point for future career decisions, couldn't draw on her service record to demonstrate capabilities to potential employers. "What did you want to do before you enlisted?" Jake asked. "Did you have plans or dreams that got interrupted by military service?" Sarah's laugh was rueful. "I enlisted straight out of high school. I was angry, rebellious, looking for structure and purpose. The military gave me both, along with skills and experiences I never could have imagined. But it also meant that I never developed a civilian identity or career aspirations. Everything I am, everything I know how to do is classified." This was perhaps the most tragic aspect of Sarah's situation. Not only had her service record been erased, but her entire adult development had occurred within a framework that she now couldn't acknowledge. Her education, her training, her work experience, her professional relationships, all of it was classified, leaving her to build a civilian life from virtually nothing. "That must feel like starting over completely." "Worse than starting over," Sarah replied. "When you start over, you can at least learn from your past mistakes and build on your previous experiences. I'm starting from nothing, but I'm not actually nothing. I'm a highly trained professional with years of experience that I can't use, skills that I can't demonstrate, and knowledge that I can't apply. It's like being an expert at everything and qualified for nothing simultaneously." Jake could see how this impossible situation would create a crisis of identity and purpose. Sarah possessed extraordinary capabilities, but was forced to pretend to be ordinary was accomplished but had to present as inexperienced, was valuable but couldn't demonstrate her worth in any conventional way. Have you considered finding work that could use some of your skills without requiring you to explain how you develop them? Jake suggested security consulting, self-defense instruction, emergency preparedness training, fields where expertise might be valued regardless of its source. Sarah shook her head. Too close to my actual background. The kind of people who work in those fields often have connections to government agencies or military units. Someone might recognize me or ask questions that I couldn't answer safely. It's safer to stick with a completely civilian cover story, even if it means underemployment. Jake was beginning to appreciate the impossible choices Sarah faced at every turn. Options that would be natural fits for her skills were too dangerous from a security standpoint, while safe career choices offered no fulfillment or adequate compensation. She was trapped between the need for financial stability and the requirements of operational security. Their conversations during this period revealed layers of complexity that Jake hadn't initially understood. Sarah wasn't just dealing with physical recovery or career transition. She was grappling with fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and belonging that had no easy answers. Do you ever regret it? Jake asked during one of their evening talks. The service, the missions, the choices that led you to this situation? Sarah was quiet for a long time, her gaze distant as she considered the question. I regret the cost, she said finally. I regret that serving my country meant sacrificing my identity, my relationships, my future prospects. I regret that I can't share my experiences with my family, can't get proper treatment for my injuries, can't use my training and expertise to build a meaningful civilian career. But Jake sensed there was more to her answer. But I don't regret the missions themselves. The intelligence we gathered saved lives, prevented attacks, protected people who will never know how close they came to danger. Even if I can't talk about it, even if I get no recognition for it, that work mattered. The cost was too high, but the value was real. Jake was moved by the way Sarah had found meaning in her service despite the personal toll it had exacted. Her ability to maintain a sense of purpose and pride in her accomplishments, even while dealing with the isolation and erasure that came with classified service, spoke to a strength of character that he found both inspiring and humbling. As Sarah's physical recovery progressed, Jake noticed changes that went beyond improved mobility and reduced pain. The simple act of having someone who knew her real background, who understood the nature of her service and sacrifices, seemed to be helping with aspects of her emotional healing that medical treatment couldn't address. I haven't had nightmares in 3 weeks, Sarah mentioned casually during one of their physical therapy sessions. Jake looked at her with surprise. You were having nightmares? Every night for years. Different scenarios, but always variations on captivity, interrogation, failed escapes. I had learned to function on 3 or 4 hours of sleep because the dreams were so frequent and intense. This was the first time Sarah had mentioned ongoing psychological effect from her captivity, and Jake realized that she had been dealing with what was essentially untreated PTSD for years. Without the ability to seek conventional therapy or treatment, she had been managing severe psychological trauma through sheer force of will and careful environmental control. What's different now? Jake asked gently. Sarah considered the question carefully. I think it's having someone who knows the truth. For years, I've been living in constant fear that someone would discover my real background, that my cover would be blown, that I would be exposed and vulnerable. Having you know who I really am and choosing to stay anyway has eliminated that particular source of anxiety. Jake understood what she was describing. The mental energy required to maintain a false identity while hiding significant trauma would have been exhausting. The relief of being able to be honest, even with just one person, was probably more therapeutic than any conventional treatment could have provided. But Sarah's improving mental state also created new challenges. As her hypervigilance decreased and her sleep improved, she began to experience emotions and reactions that she had been suppressing for years. The grief, anger, and loss that she had pushed aside in favor of survival were now surfacing in ways that were sometimes overwhelming. "I'm angry," Sarah said one afternoon, her voice tight with emotion. They were working on strength exercises for her injured leg. "I'm furious that I gave so much and got so little in return. I'm angry that other veterans get parades and benefits and recognition while I get nothing. I'm angry that I can't even tell my own parents what I did with my life." Jake had been waiting for this moment. He had seen similar processes with other veterans. The initial relief of survival giving way to rage about the cost of service and the inadequacy of support systems. For Sarah, this anger was complicated by the additional layer of enforced secrecy that prevented her from accessing most conventional sources of help. "You have every right to be angry," Jake said simply. "What you've been through, what you've sacrificed, the way you've been treated since your service ended. It's not fair, and it's not right." Sarah looked at him with surprise. "I thought you might try to talk me out of it. Help me find perspective or gratitude or some way to make peace with the situation." Jake shook his head. "Some situations don't call for peace or acceptance. Some situations call for righteous anger and a refusal to pretend that wrong treatment is acceptable. You've earned the right to be furious about this." The validation of her anger seemed to unlock something in Sarah. Over the following weeks, she began to express frustrations and resentments that she had been carrying for years. The unfairness of her situation, the isolation it had created, the opportunities it had cost her, all of it poured out in conversations that were sometimes painful but clearly necessary. "I see other women my age getting married, starting families, building careers, and I know that none of that is possible for me," Sarah said during one particularly difficult evening. "How do you build a life with someone when you can't tell them who you really are? How do you have children when you can't explain where mommy was for 6 years?" These were questions that had no easy answers, problems for which there were no established solutions. Jake found himself wishing he could offer more than just a listening ear, but he was beginning to understand that sometimes bearing witness to someone's pain was more valuable than trying to fix it. "Maybe the traditional path isn't the only path," Jake suggested. "Maybe there are ways to build meaningful relationships and a fulfilling life that don't require complete honesty about your past." Sarah's expression was skeptical. "How? Every relationship I've attempted since leaving the service has failed because I couldn't be authentic. People sense when you're holding back significant parts of yourself, and they either push for more intimacy than I can provide, or they lose interest and move on." Jake understood the dilemma she was describing. Healthy relationships required trust and vulnerability, but Sarah's situation made both dangerous. The very qualities that would make her a good partner, loyalty, strength, the ability to handle crises, were also the qualities she couldn't fully demonstrate without raising questions about their source. "What about relationships with other veterans?" Jake asked. "People who understand operational security and the need for privacy about certain aspects of military service?" "I've tried that," Sarah replied. "But most veterans, even special operations veterans, can talk about their service to some degree. They have war stories, deployment experiences, military connections that they can share. I have to pretend that I was never deployed, never saw combat, never developed the skills that are obvious to anyone with military experience." Jake was beginning to realize that Sarah's situation was even more isolating than he had initially understood. She was cut off not just from civilians who couldn't relate to her experiences, but also from the veteran community that might otherwise have provided understanding and support. "There are others like you, though, aren't there? Other people who served in classified units and are dealing with similar reintegration challenges." Sarah's expression became guarded. "Even if there are, we wouldn't be able to identify each other or connect. That's part of operational security. No contact with former colleagues, no acknowledgement of shared experiences, no mutual support networks. We're all out here dealing with this alone." The systematic nature of the isolation struck Jake as particularly cruel. Not only had Sarah and others like her been forced to sacrifice their identities for their service, but they had been denied even the possibility of mutual support with people who might understand their situation. It was isolation by design, ensuring that classified veterans remained scattered and invisible rather than forming communities that might attract attention or present security risks. As these conversations continued, Jake found himself becoming more than just a friend or support system. He was becoming a repository for Sarah's authentic self, the only person in her civilian life who knew who she really was and what she had experienced. It was a responsibility that he took seriously, understanding that his presence in her life represented her only connection to her true identity. "I need to ask you something," Sarah said one evening as they sat together on her couch. "And I need you to be honest with me." Jake nodded, sensing the seriousness of what was coming. "Are you doing this out of pity? Staying involved in my life because you feel sorry for me? Because if that's what this is, I need to know now." The directness of her question caught Jake off guard, but he realized that it came from a place of deep vulnerability. Sarah had been hurt not just physically, but emotionally, betrayed by circumstances beyond her control. The idea that his support might be based on sympathy rather than genuine care would be devastating to her. "No," Jake said firmly. "It's not pity. It's respect. Admiration, actually. You've survived experiences that would have broken most people, and you've maintained your integrity and humanity despite being abandoned by the very system you served. That's not pitiable. It's remarkable." Sarah studied his face carefully, clearly evaluating his sincerity. "Then what is this? Where are we to each other?" It was a fair question, and Jake realized he didn't have a simple answer. Their relationship had evolved beyond friendship, but was complicated by the unusual circumstances of how they had met and what they had shared. He cared about Sarah deeply, but he wasn't sure if that caring was romantic, protective, or something else entirely. "I don't know what to call it," he admitted, "but I know that you've become important to me in ways I wasn't expecting. Your strength, your resilience, the way you've refused to let your experiences make you bitter or cruel. Being around you makes me want to be a better person." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Jake could see her processing his words. When she spoke again, her voice was softer than usual. "I haven't felt important to anyone in a very long time, or valued for who I really am rather than who I pretend to be. Thank you for that." The intimacy of the moment hung between them, charged with possibilities neither of them was quite ready to explore. But Jake could feel something shifting in their relationship, a deepening connection that went beyond shared military experience or caregiver support. As Sarah's physical therapy progressed and her mobility improved, she began to venture out more frequently. These outings, usually accompanied by Jake, provided opportunities to observe how she navigated the world as a civilian. Her awareness of her surroundings, her careful evaluation of other people, her instinctive positioning near exits and away from crowds. All of these behaviors marked her as someone who had been trained for survival in hostile environments. "Do you ever feel safe?" Jake asked during one of these outings, a simple trip to a farmer's market that Sarah had approached with the tactical awareness of a reconnaissance mission. Sarah considered the question seriously. "I feel safer than I used to. Being around you, having someone who knows my background and accepts it, has reduced some of the anxiety about discovery. But completely safe? No, I don't think that's possible for someone with my background." Jake understood what she meant. True safety required the ability to be vulnerable and unguarded, luxuries that Sarah's training and experiences had made impossible. She would always be scanning for threats, evaluating escape routes, maintaining readiness for dangers that would probably never materialize. But he was also beginning to see small changes in her behavior that suggested some level of increased comfort. She walked closer to him in crowds, allowed him to position himself between her and potential threats, occasionally let her guard down enough to laugh at something genuinely funny rather than simply polite. These small signs of trust and relaxation felt like significant victories to Jake. Each moment when Sarah allowed herself to be slightly less vigilant, Every time she shared an authentic reaction rather than a carefully controlled response, represented progress toward a life that might include not just survival, but genuine happiness. As winter turned toward spring and Sarah's leg continued to heal, both of them began to understand that their relationship had reached an inflection point. The initial crisis that had brought them together was resolving, but the connection they had developed showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, the growing trust and intimacy between them suggested possibilities that neither had initially anticipated. "What happens when I'm fully recovered?" Sarah asked one evening as they watched the sun set from her apartment balcony. "When I don't need help with appointments or mobility or any of the practical things that brought us together?" It was a question Jake had been wondering about himself. Their relationship had begun with a medical emergency and had deepened through the process of recovery and reintegration. But what would sustain it once those external circumstances resolved? "I guess we find out what we mean to each other when crisis isn't holding us together," Jake replied honestly. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'd like to find out. If you're willing to see where this goes when it's not about medical care or support systems." Jake really looked at her, seeing not just the patient he had treated or the veteran whose story had moved him, but the woman who had become central to his thoughts and feelings over the past several months. Her intelligence, her strength, her capacity for both vulnerability and resilience had created something in him that felt like the beginning of love. "I'd like that too," he said, reaching for her hand. "Whatever this becomes, wherever it leads, I want to find out together." 8 months after Sarah's accident, the relationship between her and Jake had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated when they first met in that emergency room. What had begun as doctor-patient care and military camaraderie had deepened into a love that was both profound and complicated, built on foundations of shared understanding and mutual respect that few couples could claim. Sarah's physical recovery had progressed beautifully. The titanium rod in her leg had integrated perfectly, and her strength and mobility had returned to levels that impressed even her demanding physical therapist. She could run again, climb, and engage in all the physical activities that had been central to her sense of identity and security. But more importantly, her emotional recovery had advanced in ways that surprised both her and Jake. The nightmares that had plagued her for years had nearly disappeared. The hypervigilance that had exhausted her for so long had decreased to manageable levels. She still checked locks and assessed escape routes instinctively, but these behaviors no longer dominated her thoughts or prevented her from engaging with the world around her. "I feel like myself again," Sarah told Jake one morning as they shared coffee on her balcony, watching the sun rise over San Diego Bay. "Not the person I was before the military. I can never go back to that innocence, but like an integrated version of who I've become. The soldier and the woman, the operative and the civilian, all existing together instead of fighting each other." Jake understood what she meant. Over the months of their relationship, he had watched Sarah learn to honor both parts of her identity, the classified warrior and the woman building a civilian life. Instead of trying to completely suppress her military training and experiences, she had found ways to channel those skills into civilian contexts that felt authentic and valuable. The breakthrough had come when Sarah decided to volunteer with a local organization that provided self-defense training for women who had experienced domestic violence. Using a carefully crafted background story that highlighted her amateur martial arts training, she was able to teach genuinely life-saving skills while maintaining her cover. For the first time since leaving the military, Sarah was using her real capabilities to serve others. "It's not the same as the missions," Sarah had explained to Jake after her first training session with a women's shelter. "The stakes are different, the scope is smaller. But seeing those women gain confidence, watching them learn to protect themselves, there's meaning in that work. Purpose that feels real and immediate." Jake had been moved by the transformation in Sarah's demeanor after she began this volunteer work. The sense of aimlessness and frustrated energy that had characterized her early recovery had been replaced by focus and satisfaction. She was still Sarah Chun, graphic designer, but now that identity included elements of her true capabilities and experiences. Their relationship had also provided Sarah with something she had never expected to find: the possibility of authentic intimacy. The process of allowing Jake to know her real history, her actual training, her genuine reactions and capabilities had been terrifying but ultimately liberating. For the first time in her adult life, Sarah was in a relationship where she didn't have to constantly monitor and modify her responses. "I love that you understand why I check the locks twice before bed," Sarah had told him during one of their deeper conversations. "I love that you don't think it's strange when I position myself to see both the entrance and exit in restaurants. I love that I don't have to pretend to be weaker or less capable or more civilian than I actually am." For Jake, loving Sarah had meant learning to appreciate forms of strength and resilience he had never encountered before. Her intelligence was sharp and tactical, her courage was absolute, and her capacity for both giving and receiving care had been forged in circumstances that would have destroyed lesser people. Being with her had expanded his own understanding of what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, and to heal. But their relationship wasn't without its challenges. The secrecy requirements that governed Sarah's life meant that their social interactions were limited and carefully managed. Jake had learned to navigate conversations with his colleagues and friends, deflecting questions about Sarah's background and finding plausible explanations for her unusual knowledge and capabilities. It's like being in a relationship with a superhero with a secret identity. Jake had joked early in their romance, though he quickly realized that the comparison was more apt than funny. Sarah's need to maintain her cover story created constant tension between authenticity and safety, requiring both of them to be thoughtful about what they shared and with whom. More seriously, they had both grappled with questions about long-term commitment and what it would mean to build a future together. Marriage would require legal documentation that could potentially compromise Sarah's carefully maintained identity. Children would raise questions about family history and military service that would be difficult to answer honestly. Even seemingly simple decisions about where to live or work had security implications that most couples never had to consider. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being fair to you," Sarah had admitted during one of their more difficult conversations. "Asking you to share a life that comes with so many limitations and complications. You could be with someone normal, someone uncomplicated, someone who could give you a traditional relationship and family." Jake's response had been immediate and emphatic. "I don't want normal or traditional or uncomplicated. I want you, all of you, including the parts that make our situation unique. The woman who could blend into any crowd, but chooses to stand with me. The soldier who gave everything for her country and is now learning to live for herself. The person who survived unimaginable things and still has the capacity for love and hope and joy." These conversations had led them to creative solutions for some of their challenges. Instead of a traditional wedding, they had created their own ceremony in Sarah's apartment, exchanging vows that acknowledged both their love and the unique circumstances that governed their lives. Instead of legal marriage, they had established powers of attorney and emergency contacts that would allow them to care for each other without requiring government documentation that could compromise Sarah's security. The question of children had been more complex. Sarah's medical history included injuries and treatments that she couldn't fully disclose to civilian doctors, making pregnancy potentially complicated. More importantly, both of them struggled with the ethical implications of bringing children into a family built on necessary deceptions. "I want children," Sarah had said during one of their late-night discussions about the future, "but I also want to be able to tell them the truth about who their mother is and what she did with her life. I don't want to raise children while maintaining a false identity, but I also can't compromise operational security by being completely honest." Jake had suggested a compromise that honored both their desires and Sarah's security requirements. What if we waited? What if we focused on building our life together first, letting time and changing circumstances potentially create opportunities for more openness down the road? The suggestion had led them to a 5-year plan that balanced their personal goals with security considerations. Sarah would continue her volunteer work and gradually build a more robust civilian identity. Jake would continue his medical career while exploring opportunities to work with veterans and military families. Together, they would save money, build relationships, and create a foundation that might eventually support a family. 5 years gives us time to see how the security landscape changes, Sarah had agreed. Technology, political situations, maybe even policies around classified service members could evolve in ways that create more options for people in my situation. As their first year together drew to a close, both Sarah and Jake had found that their relationship had become a source of healing that went beyond their individual recoveries. Jake's work as a civilian emergency medicine doctor had taken on new meaning as he understood more deeply the long-term costs of military service and the inadequacy of support systems for veterans. He had begun volunteering with veteran organizations and advocating for better mental health resources for former special operations personnel. Sarah, meanwhile, had discovered that sharing her story with Jake, even in its limited and careful way, had reduced the psychological burden of her secrets. She was still bound by classification requirements and operational security, but having one person who knew the truth had eliminated the exhausting mental effort of constant deception. I never realized how much energy I was spending on maintaining my cover until I had someone I didn't have to lie to, Sarah reflected. It's like I've been holding my breath for years and finally learned how to breathe normally again. Their relationship had also created an unexpected support network. Through Jake's connections in the medical community and Sarah's volunteer work, they had begun to encounter other people whose lives had been shaped by military service, government work, or other forms of classified employment. While Sarah couldn't be completely open about her background, she had found a community of people who understood the challenges of transitioning from high-security careers to civilian life. It's not the same as having contact with other shadow angels, Sarah acknowledged. But being around people who understand the concept of classified service, who know that some jobs require secrecy and sacrifice, helped me feel less like an alien trying to blend in with humans. The evening that marked exactly 1 year since Sarah's accident found them sitting together in the same spot where they had shared their first real conversation. The balcony of Sarah's apartment overlooking San Diego Bay. But everything else had changed. Sarah's leg had healed completely, leaving only a thin scar as evidence of the injury that had brought them together. Her apartment had been redecorated to reflect not just security concerns, but comfort and personal taste. Most importantly, the woman herself had transformed from an isolated, struggling veteran to someone who had found love, purpose, and hope. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been working that night? Sarah asked as they watched the lights of the city come alive below them. Jake considered the question seriously. I think you would have healed physically regardless of who treated you. But I also think we both would have missed something important. You've changed my life as much as I've hopefully changed yours. Sarah smiled, the expression open and genuine in a way that had been impossible for her a year earlier. You've given me something I never thought I could have, the ability to be loved for who I really am, not who I pretend to be. That's a gift I'll never take for granted. As they sat together in comfortable silence, both Sarah and Jake understood that their story was still being written. The challenges that had brought them together were largely resolved, but new adventures and obstacles lay ahead. Sarah's volunteer work was expanding, and she was considering starting a nonprofit organization focused on helping women develop self-defense skills and personal security awareness. Jake had been offered an opportunity to develop a trauma program specifically designed for veterans with complex medical histories and security-related treatment limitations. Whatever comes next, Jake said, taking Sarah's hand, we'll face it together. Sarah squeezed his hand in return, her grip strong and sure. Together, she agreed. The word carried weight that went beyond simple romance or companionship. For Sarah, together meant the possibility of building a future that honored both her classified past and her civilian present. For Jake, it meant the privilege of sharing his life with someone whose strength and resilience had redefined his understanding of what love could be. Their relationship had begun in trauma and crisis, forged in the intersection of medical emergency and military service. But it had evolved into something profound and sustaining, a partnership built on truth, understanding, and the recognition that some wounds heal best when they're not carried alone. As the stars appeared in the darkening sky above San Diego Bay, Sarah found herself thinking not about the missions she couldn't discuss or the recognition she would never receive, but about the future she was building with someone who saw her completely and loved her unconditionally. For the first time in years, she was looking forward rather than looking back, planning for joy rather than preparing for survival. The room that had fallen silent when Jake discovered her combat past had become the foundation for something neither of them had expected to find, a love story that honored both their service to others and their commitment to each other. Sarah would always be wounded by her experiences, but she would never again be wordless about what mattered most. In Jake, she had found not just a partner, but a witness to her true self. In Sarah, Jake had found not just love, but a deeper understanding of courage and sacrifice. Together, they had created something that neither classification requirements nor past trauma could diminish. A relationship built on absolute honesty and unconditional acceptance. The woman who had once been a ghost in the military system, whose service had been erased and whose sacrifices had gone unrecognized, had finally found someone who saw her clearly and chose to stay. The SEAL medic who had dedicated his life to healing others had discovered that sometimes the most important person to save was the one who saved herself, but needed someone to help her remember what she was worth. Their story had begun with wounded silence, but it had become something far more powerful, a testament to the healing power of love that saw beyond scars and secrets to the courage and humanity that no classification system could ever erase. In a world that had forced Sarah to be invisible, Jake had made her seen. In a life that had demanded Sarah's